Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. In this episode of The Global Agora, I speak with Monika Sus, a professor at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences, an expert on European security and EU foreign policy. Together we explore whether Europe is already at war with Russia, and why the distinction between war and hybrid warfare may no longer hold. We discuss Poland's view of Russia as an existential threat, division within the European Union, the uncertain future of NATO, and whether Europe must begin seriously preparing for a security architecture that can function without the United States. And ultimately, we confront the most unsettling question of all. In today's climate of strategic uncertainty, can Europe still rely on its closest ally? So would American President Donald Trump fight for Gdansk? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. In a time when everyone else is unprepared for the apocalypse that awaits us, Ukrainians are the ones experiencing it. This is what Ukrainian security expert Alexander Kraev said to me a few days ago. He argues that we already live in a new international system of total wars and full-fledged conflicts that stretches the continents. Would you agree with his grim assessment?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think that if we talk about Europe, and this is the perspective that I have because I do not know enough about conflict in the other part of the world. And of course, there are many, and they're going at the same time as the Russia's war in Ukraine or the Gaza war. And I'm referring here, for example, to Sudan. And I think that we Europeans often tend to look at our own neighborhood. And that's also something that is quite understandable, I think. But I mean, from a perspective, of the European continent, I think that he's right to the extent that I would also argue that we are at war with Russia. And by we, I mean Europe. And I'm talking about hybrid warfare. And the distinction that I made here is that for us, this is hybrid warfare. And this is about attacking our critical infrastructure, acts of disruptions of, energy grids, for example, trains and so on. And we have seen this many, many times in many European countries over the last, I'd say, 5-6 years, probably. Of course, with the acceleration of that within the last 4 years when the full-scale invasion has started. But Russia has been also meddling in European elections before 2022. So we have to be aware of that. So I think on that account, we are in a conflict with Russia, yes. And I think the main point here for me is that we see this as a hybrid war because we are talking about acts of disruption. We are not seeing missiles flying over European cities or soldiers on the ground. But for Russia, this is just warfare. I think that Russia really does not differentiate between hybrid warfare and warfare. This is one of the elements of warfare coming from and implied by the Russian Federation. So if we see this from this perspective, then yes, I think that he's right by saying that we are living in an era of ongoing conflicts and basically the picture is quite grim, yes.
So should we stop to differentiate?
Yes, I think we should stop yes, I think that in terms of language and in terms of communicating this to people, to citizens, we should be much more blunt about what is really happening, of course, and this is a thin line between being honest to the citizens and basically causing panic. And of course, panic is the last thing that we need because panic kills resilience. But I think that in order to make our European societies more resilient towards the Russian threat, coming now in the form of hybrid attacks, we have to communicate to our citizens much more what is actually happening because the hybrid warfare has one feature that it's very difficult to pinpoint the source often, right? And it's basically it dispersed. So there is one small attack, let's say, happening on the Polish train trails. Then, there are a couple of balloons flying over Lithuania. Then there is another small attack, let's say, on energy grid in Germany, for example. So people do not notice that this actually comes together in a quite scary and also quite complex picture. But again, the point is not to scare people. The point is to make people aware, because I think only if people are aware of what is actually going on, they can then start producing some resilience strategies towards that. And I think that's the whole point. I am not saying that we have to basically put everyone in the army and start conscription right away. I'm just saying that every citizen should be aware what is going on, to the extent, of course, we are talking about publicly available data and information, and basically, become more resilient towards that.
Monica, for 4 years now, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has been ongoing, and the fact is that Russia already attacked Ukraine in 2014. Despite joint efforts to help Kyiv, it is possible to debate how individual countries diverge in their perception of security threats in Europe, including their views on Russia. Is this a problem when we look at the European Union's attempts to strengthen its defense capabilities?
The different threat perceptions regarding Russia will stay with us because this is simply a function of geography. To not only geography, there's also history involved, and we see, how countries that, are fairly close to Russia, and I'm talking about Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, for example, how different they react to wars. I think geography matters a lot, obviously, because let's say Portugal or Greece, they are not under the direct threat of being attacked by the Russian soldiers. I would say it's a challenge for the EU, but I wouldn't necessarily see that this is a huge problem. I think there's another problem, and I will come to that in a second, but I think, although we have different threat perceptions on Russia, the EU was still able and is able, to issue sanctions, to help Ukraine via European Peace Facility, and basically to support Ukrainians in a great extent. So I think that's a challenge for the EU, but it does not tie the hands of the European Union. I think what is actually more of a problem is unity among the Europeans regarding probably, there is a combination of issues we can throw here. But if you look at Hungary, for example, which is very close on the MAGA line with the United States, Hungary is blocking the tranches from the European Peace Facility to Ukraine. And this is becoming a problem, increasingly so. And Hungary also said that they won't allow Ukraine to join the European Union, which would be a very resilient, actually, strategy after, of course, the hot conflict pauses. So I think the internal divisions among Europeans that concern ideology, relations to the United States, and also, of course, relations with Russia, these are actually bigger problems than the threat perception.
So what are the top 3 security threats for Poland? Russia, and Russia?
Yes. For Poland, I'd say external security threats, yes. Although, Russia is definitely top security threat, has been for quite some time for the Polish people, for the Polish state. There's increasingly also, talk about how the, let's say, the MAGA movement weakens the European Union, and a weak European Union is a threat for Poland, obviously. Poland needs strong institutions and strong organizations like NATO, like the EU. So anything that actually weakens, for example, NATO's commitments to Article 5 or the internal cohesion of the EU, and this is something actively strived by the current American administration, that's also a threat for Poland.
Monica, you mentioned a couple of points already, but the current governments of Hungary and Slovakia do not publicly label Russia as a threat, even though their countries border Ukraine. What does the debate in Poland look like regarding these positions of their partners in the V4?
Well, I think that the V4, because of this very different perception of threat, and again, as you said before, for Poland, Russia is an existential threat. We are not talking about any threat. We are talking about the existential threat for Poland. So I think that on that account, V4 is basically, it's not functioning. And I know there are still, V4 meetings. And this is very good because you have to have open channels of communication. And still, we are talking about neighboring countries. So there's a lot we should and we must talk about, like, I don't know, transportation, train connections, and whatever you have. So definitely, I am not saying that we have to abolish V4. But V4 has been reduced to a mechanism of basically low-key communication between the countries as much as necessarily, but there is no strategic thinking in that. And because we have this very different threat perceptions, and not only this, but also very different policies towards both Russia and Ukraine, you cannot use V4 as something that actually, I think every country also wanted to use it as basically, a tool to impact the European Union's agenda, for example, to enhance the interests of these 4 countries on the European level. You simply cannot do this because we do not have common interest if it comes to strategic questions on foreign policy.
But even in Poland, there is a relatively significant political force that can be described as pro-Russian. According to polls, 8 to 9% of voters would support the far-right confederation of the Polish crown. How are these radicals winning over Polish voters?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, that's definitely also a threat to the Polish democracy and to the Polish political scene. But I think that we also have to remember that the party that, let's say, still has more chances to win the elections, namely the Law and Justice Party that used to rule in Poland until 2023, until the end of 2023, they are very hawkish on Russia. And you see this actually because we have in Poland, of course, basically two sources of power if it comes to foreign policy. That's the government and the president. The president has also some competences in this regard. He is close with Law and Justice Party. He used to be a member of the party. And although, there are many differences, there are many serious differences on many issues on Russia, there is still a very strong consensus in Poland. Confederation is definitely an outlier here, but they're also divided internally. And you will find politicians from Confederation who will also say, we have to support Ukraine. We have to send weapons to Ukraine. But of course, the narrative is a very much different one than the one that, let's say, the governing coalition now, or even the Law and Justice is saying in Poland. So I do not see a prospect of Confederation winning the next parliamentary elections. But yes, they are speaking to a part of the Polish society who is tired with the support of Ukrainians, who thinks that, bringing Ukraine, for example, to NATO would be a threat for Poland because we would be bringing a country into NATO that is very closely connected to the Russian state. So we cannot hide that the divisions are there. But I think on the broader picture is still that there's, I would say, 80% of citizens in Poland supporting very strong help to Ukraine. And basically, they do this from different reasons. And we probably don't have time to allude to that. But I think the main point is we know that Ukrainians are basically fighting on behalf of us. If Ukrainian fails, then Poland or the Baltic countries will be next. And this is something that, again, I think 80% of Poles basically agree upon.
Monica, you said that Poland would like to see a strong European Union. In fact, you probably don't remember it, but in 2015, we have been sitting in Belgrade at the Belgrade Security Forum, and I interviewed you, and you said that, of course, we know that the EU is moving through the crisis many times, but you also said at the time, in 2015, that we might be facing too many crises. And it's over 10 years of our conversation. And of course, we went through pandemics, the full-scale war, and so on. Are you afraid, are you concerned that we might not make it? The EU?
I think two things on that. I think, first of all, still you have to differentiate. Poland is a divided country. And again, cannot hide this, right? So I definitely belong to the group of people that want to see the European Union stronger. There is definitely a substantial part of the society. If we take the last presidential elections, because that was the last time that Poles voted. So basically, let's say from May and June last year, then we can say that we basically speak about two Polands, So, and they are pretty much equal. So there is the one that says that we need strong European Union, strong also meaning integrated in terms of security and defense, not undermining NATO, that's very important, but still much stronger integrated if it comes to security and defense. And there is another part of Poland that definitely, and we are not talking about any kind of Pole exit. Poles appreciate very much the European Union, but the other part of Poland basically sees value in the EU, but does not want the EU to, let's say, intervene in internal issues of the Polish state. So for them, the EU should be as strong as the nation states basically can be. So they value much more the importance of the nation state without going too much into further integration. But yes, but on the average, definitely I still would argue that, the Polish government definitely wants to see a stronger European Union. Again, there are some caveats because Poland, for example, has no intention for now to enter the Eurozone, right? But that's another topic. But I think that I'm still hopeful, I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as you mentioned, we are on the 4th-year mark, which is obviously, a tragedy for Ukrainian people. And again, also for Russian citizens that are not necessarily, supporting the Putin's regime. But I think that actually the last 4 years, it has been a difficult time for the EU. But I think it has also showed that the EU, when it wants to act, it will find a way. And that's, that's for me the example with, I just give you one example with the Russian asset, basically, the use of them being vetoed by Belgium. Not only by Belgium, there are also other countries, who didn't like the idea.
Yes.
But then the EU, in the end, found a way with financing help for Ukraine through basically debt. And if you go back to 2015 and compare the European Union between 2015 and now, we are a much stronger union. We are for the very first time going into common debt on defense issues. So we are a different union. And I'm not saying that there's everything only rosy and bright within the organization, definitely not. But on the average, I think that we survived through many crises, as you said. And we are coming out of that, I hope, when the war ends, stronger than we've been before.
Poland is quite often mentioned almost as a textbook example of how a country should behave in today's uncertain security environment. In 2026, Warsaw will spend nearly 5% of its GDP on defense, is purchasing virtually all available weapon systems, and is strengthening border protection, for example, through the East Shield program. As I said, from the outside, this looks like as an almost perfect approach. Is it perfect?
No, definitely it's not perfect. I think Poland is really I like to call this a state of shock if it comes to the US policy. Obviously, the US has been the main guarantor of Polish security for the last decades. And it's very threatening for Poland to see what is happening with the United States. And again, I am subscribing to voices of experts who say that, well, you just cannot be sure whether US will be a reliable ally. You cannot be sure of that anymore. And, I also don't agree with American administration saying that NATO has never been as strong as it is because, now countries are spending money on defense. Yes, that's true, but undermining Article 5, so the main collective defense commitment of the alliance by the American administration weakens NATO quite strong in my opinion. So Poland is basically torn between, what will happen with the American security commitments and how much we can actually integrate within the European path, let's say, of that. So on that, there are definitely two parallel strategies. And there's also, I would say, the most important one. And that's the third strategy, as you mentioned, basically strengthening national forces and strengthening national defense capabilities. Because as we know, in the end, it all comes down to national defense capabilities that can be used within a coherent approach, for example, under the flag of NATO. But we are still talking about national forces. NATO has no forces. There are national forces. So on that, definitely Poland is trying to, let's say, diversify, I would say. But there are problems. And I think the most illustrative example is now the debate around SAFE, the defense mechanism proposed by the European Commission. And yes, there are many people many politicians from the Law and Justice Party trying to basically tell, a story that is not true, like factually not true. But as we know, does not always matter whether it actually something is true or not. So they are basically trying to convince the Polish audience that this is a threat for Poland because it will force us to buy European defense capabilities. It will tie our hands in decision making if it comes to what we are buying and from which country, which obviously is not true. But still, this is something that you see some politicians in Poland arguing about. So I wouldn't say, that this is all easy and nice. And one more issue, and I will close on that, is that you said yourself that Poland is spending almost 5% of GDP on defense. We have been spending between 3.5 and 4.8 actually over the last couple of years. So there is an increase of the spending. And it already has some consequences for the other spending, right, in the country. So you see that, for example, science, schools, academia, and so on are underspended. Same goes for medical care. Of course, the government will no cut social benefits because it will be a suicidal move in every politics. But the society is starting to feel, the fiscal pressure. And so far, it has been going fine because Poland basically goes into debt in order to finance defense spending. But it won't take long, before we have to have a really serious debate in the country about trade-offs between high defense spending and other areas that the money will basically be missing.
Monica, last two questions. You recently said for the Visegrad Insight that Europe should begin imagining a security architecture that functions without the US, not as a preference, but as a contingency planning. From your perspective, what should be the core features of European security architecture that function without the US? For example, Defense Commissioner Kubilius said that European countries need to create a rapid reaction force up to the 100,000 troops to replace American soldiers. So your core features of European security architecture.
I mean, to me, the core features should be definitely much stronger defense capabilities. And again, I am making this point again and again because, there is a gap between defense spending and building up defense capabilities. It's not only the time gap that you need some time in order, to build up the capabilities, obviously, but there's also, and there was a huge topic at the Munich Security Conference. We now have actually a lot of money in the market, and I am talking broadly about the European Union and European countries. For example, Germany is investing heavily in defense. So if you have a lot of money in the market, you really have to take care about spending the money effectively and with great efficiency and transparency, because we are talking about sensitive industries. So I would like to see, as the core feature of European security architecture, strong capabilities of European countries. And the second feature for me would be some sort of coordination. Of course, the preference will still be NATO. But so far, the leadership of, basically simplifying a lot, but of NATO has been in the hands of the United States. So yes, I think that we need to work towards, replacing the leadership structure from the United States by European allies and basically be able, when we have to basically deploy forces without the United States. But yes, we are lacking critical capabilities. And yes, we have to take some tough decisions in order to speed up the process of basically replacing the American capabilities with European ones.
Then one last thing to wrap it up, and I suspect what your answer would be. But in your opinion, would the current US administration fight for Gdansk? And of course, for those who don't know, I'm paraphrasing an infamous appeasement slogan created on the eve of the World War II. Why died for Gdansk?
I really don't know what to say, because, well...
And that's the problem, I think.
Yes, exactly. That's the problem, because the automatic answer should be yes, of course, because we're an ally, we're in NATO, there is Article 5. And yes, I know that, there are still many American politicians and huge parts of American administration who see the defense commitment of the United States as key. But on the other hand, and I think that's something that we can perhaps close up the whole discussion with, we are talking about uncertainty. And the uncertainty brought by President Trump is definitely not something that I see as positive. I, of course, see, Trump moved many European allies to higher spending. Great. But again, I think the uncertainty he brought into the system is actually quite risky. And the fact that I cannot answer the question with full confidence, I think actually shows the problem.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.